Well, thanks very much, Hayat, and thanks to you and Cole and all the other organizers and the other the sponsoring organizations and all these activists, incredible activists across Massachusetts working on not only stopping wars and militarism, but all of the related issues. It's so important that we're meeting together for these kinds of discussions. So I'm really delighted to be with you. Sorry it's not in person, but we've all learned a lot about how to do stuff not in person, I suppose. We're looking at a world right now that is very much mobilized for war. There's full-scale war, of course, waging in Ukraine and Russia. In Yemen, which we hear much less about, the ceasefire is barely holding in Yemen. But huge military conflicts that are killing hundreds and thousands of people around the world, whether they are civil or internal conflicts or wars, insurgencies, drug wars, the leftover wars of the global war on terror, which never ended, even as we move into a new stage of potential wars between major powers. But wars that are continuing to go on in Myanmar, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Mali and Ethiopia, and in Colombia and Congo and Sudan and South Sudan, in Mexico, in so many countries around the world, along with the threats that are escalating of extraordinary wars that could erupt between the US and China, between the US and NATO against Russia. All of these wars themselves cause, besides the destruction that they cause themselves, they cause broad-scale poverty, they cause environmental catastrophe, they cause refugee crises, they cause authoritarianism to rise. And in almost all of these wars, you see a massive amount of US arms present. Sometimes you see US troops, much more rare these days than it used to be, thankfully. And sometimes you see US bombers, but you almost always see US arms, often on both sides of these internal conflicts. And of course, war is not the only cause of these massive crises that are erupting in the US and around the world. Poverty itself causes massive refugee crises. The environmental catastrophe causes refugee crises. Inequality causes authoritarianism. So it's not always just about war, but militarism is central to all of these catastrophic developments. Certainly we know that the Pentagon is the biggest polluter of all the institutions in the world, that military spending causes poverty, that the military itself foments racism. So we need to understand that role historically, that militarism has been a key component, not a sideline, of US history from its founding as a settler colony on this land. It was necessary to have better militarization to commit genocide against the indigenous people of this land. It was necessary to have powerful militarized police forces to maintain a slave-based economy in this country. So we need a movement that challenges militarism as well as the military, that challenges war and militarism. And it's partly about having a movement focused on that issue, the peace movement, the anti-war movement, the anti-empire movement, whatever we want to call it. But it's crucial that we have a strong movement that defines itself in that way, but also that we understand that part of our role is to get that information about militarism to all the other social movements that are on the rise, whether they are fighting against racism, fighting against misogyny, fighting for immigrant rights, for trans rights, fighting for the climate. All of these movements desperately need this information to use in their own strategies because of this powerful connection. I think you're going to hear soon from my friend and IPS colleague, Lindsay Kashgarian, about the costs of militarization at home, the economic and social and environmental costs. I think what John raised earlier about the militarization of the Arctic as one example of the dangers of this, the militarization of Europe as a region in the wake of the war in Ukraine is a key component of it. And something that occurred to me yesterday at the Fire Drill Friday protests, which are back in person in Washington, with Jane Fonda leading an incredible mobilization to keep the focus on climate in general, but specifically right now on stopping Manchin's and others' dirty deal, which I won't go into all the details of it. I think people are more or less familiar with what that would mean. And one of the parts of that discussion is understanding that part of the strategy of people in Congress, Democrats as well as Republicans, is to get this thing passed by including it in what's considered a must-pass resolution that will be voted on during this next 4 weeks of this last period of this Congress. And what we're talking about there is the NDAA, the defense budget. And that by including the dirty deal in the defense budget, the theory goes, they would have to pass it. Now, there's a lot of opposition to it, so it may not happen. But very few people are talking about the very notion of defining the military budget, which this year is going to go up to somewhere around $850 billion. Just imagine that, $850 billion for 1 year, just 1 year. That's over half the entire discretionary budget. And to say that that's the must-pass resolution, that you can guarantee something terrible will be passed because we have to pass that, when did that become a must-pass anything? So we have to keep our eye on this broad question of what does it mean to be looking at the military spending of this country. Military money fuels a militarized economy across the board. My friend Laura Flanders, who did an extraordinary television show, she does the Laura Flanders show, on some of what's going on in North Carolina, but I think is probably far more prevalent around the country, perhaps including in Massachusetts, than any of us are necessarily aware of all the time. The establishment of private training camps designed, as she puts it, to privatize the military and militarize the public resources, but to build these extraordinary private training camps to train often military veterans to become police officers, and ultimately to provide training for racist thugs involved in the white supremacy movement in this country without oversight, in often small towns with majority brown and black populations, based on the assumption that nobody will really pay attention. If they bring in a little bit of investment to the local community, nobody will bother looking at what they actually are doing. They're assuming that. And this becomes the centerpiece of where white supremacists are getting their military training. So wars are creating this phenomenon of veterans who can't get jobs except by going into police work or military training. And it's a very, very dangerous process of the overall militarization of our country. Right now, the war in Ukraine is very much at the military item that's at the center of our discussion in this country and globally as well. Partly in this country, because of racism, we need to be clear about that these are mainly white Europeans. We saw a real distinction with the African and Asian students and others who were working and studying in Ukraine, who were not welcomed the way native Ukrainians, who are white people, white Europeans, who were welcomed as they should be at the borders with hot soup and toys for the children and warm clothes and a guarantee of a home for at least 2 years until they could go back to their own homes. That's how every refugee in the world should be welcomed. But we know that not all of them are. The Palestinians are not, the Afghans are not, the Iraqis are not, the Somalis are not. And that's part of our struggle to support the right of all refugees, using the example we now have, that we now know it's possible to welcome refugees the way they should be welcomed, based on how most of the refugees from Ukraine have been welcomed. But we also see in the context of the war in Ukraine that Europe, which as an aspiration, the project of creating a unified Europe was talked about from the beginning as a project of human rights. Now, that's not even on the agenda as an aspiration. It was never a reality, but it was an aspirational idea, and that was a good one. But now that's not even being talked about. Now it's Europe as a military power in its own right, so that there will be more than 2% of every country's GDP put into the military. Countries like Germany, that since World War II were reluctant, for all the right reasons, to export arms, are suddenly jumping over each other to send more arms to Ukraine and putting 100 billion euros into their military just this year. You know, this is even before we get to the expansion of NATO, these are the consequences of the war in Ukraine. We need to understand that US diplomacy must go forward, and at the legal level, that means for our government, what we demand of our government, they should be talking, among other things, about the diplomacy that's needed between the US and Russia, even aside from the question of the war in Ukraine, where, of course, Ukrainians must play the dominant role in any diplomacy that goes forward. But the US has a number of items it has to negotiate with Russia that's separate from that. Going back to all of the abandoned nuclear weapons agreements that are so desperately needed at this time of nuclear escalation in Ukraine and elsewhere. The US base in Poland, just less than 100 miles from the Russian border. That's something that the US and Russia need to be talking about. Clarifying that US sanctions against Russia will in fact be lifted when there's a ceasefire in place. So all of that is crucial. All of that has to go on between the US and Russia. Can't wait for the final negotiations that are so desperately, urgently needed that involve Ukraine and Russia as well. So when we talk about taking on the military-industrial complex, stopping the war profiteering, these are all the demands that we have to make on our government. We need a diplomatic strategy as well for the peace movement, which will go far beyond what we demand day to day of our government. Not only stopping the war profiteering, but stopping NATO. We need diplomacy, not war, in every example of all of these wars. We need to support all the refugees, not only Ukrainian refugees. And we know that we need a much broader movement mobilization that is capable of doing that. We need to be able to cut the military budget to fund healthcare and education and childcare and elder care and jobs and the climate, all of these things. We need to expose the racism and Islamophobia and xenophobia that is inherent in US military actions around the world and within the US military. You know, one example is the Poor People's Campaign, when they speak of the intersecting injustices that go on in this country. That means Martin Luther King's 3 evils of racism, poverty, and militarism, plus climate. And I will end, so that I'm hoping we have a lot of time to discuss this. I will end with one example of something as simple as the child tax credit, you know, which was increased massively in the context of COVID. And one of the biggest crimes of our society was that we have child poverty at such a huge rate. And that new child tax credit escalation cut child poverty in half in the first year of the pandemic. And now that COVID is considered pretty much over, the emergency is over, the tax credit expansion is cut, it's over, it's done, and child poverty is skyrocketing again. Martin Luther King, who told us that we need to see war as an enemy of the poor and attack it as such, Dr. King would tell us that the military budget has something to do with why we are now cutting the child tax credit and sending millions of children back into poverty. We have to learn and to teach those lessons again and again. That's how we build a movement that can challenge this crisis. Thank you.